Welcome to the ALTIS Podcast. I am your host, Stu McMillan. In this series of podcasts, I'm sitting down with some of the speakers, hopefully all the speakers, from the upcoming ALTIS Speed Summit taking place this June in Chicago. And if you haven't grabbed your ticket yet, the ALTIS Speed Summit, presented by 3x4 Genetics, is set to be the most impactful speed event ever held. 3 days of deep learning, June 6th, 7th, and 8th, with top coaches, scientists, and performance leaders from all across the world in all sorts of different sports. Thank you to our sponsors, 3x4 Genetics, Stat Sports, 1080 Sprint, and Team Builder for making it all possible. Today, I'm joined by Javier Miller-Estrada, co-founder of Ignite Performance. He's a sport movement specialist and one of the key contributors to Emergence, my good friend Sean Mishka's company, which explores ecological dynamics and skill acquisition in sport. Javier's doing some really interesting work at the intersection of skill acquisition and strength and conditioning, blending physical preparation with a more nuanced, movement-driven view of what athletes actually need to do on the field of play or on the court or on the track. We talked about these two domains and how these two domains are coming together, why that matters, and what it means for how we coach, program, and think about long-term athlete development. I started by asking him, what does he do and why does he do it?
All right. Well, what do? I do a few things. So one is I am the co-owner of a business called Ignite Performance. We work with high school athletes. So, people think of speed and agility and the like. But for me, it is much more than that. One of the reasons why I enjoy high school athletes is because I feel like it's kind of a very critical time for someone's development. So I really enjoy the impact of meeting someone when they're kind of forming who they are as a person. So that's kind of role one. We're located in Chandler, Arizona, not too far from you and not too far from ALTIS. And then where we met was through my role at Emergence. So I am a team member at Emergence, and my specific role there is to run a podcast called the Adaptable Athlete Podcast, which you have been on with our mutual friend, Sean Mishka. We won't get into him too much. We'll try to keep Sean out of it. We'll try our best. But I do that because our mission, our goal with Emergence is to try to bring clarity to a modern approach to skill acquisition. A lot of the times, the way I think coaches either do something because they've always done it, or they do it because their predecessors did it. And so what we're trying to do is provide frameworks and a practical application to this modern approach to skill acquisition and to human movement and to movement training in general. So within that role, as far as the podcast goes, I love interviewing people. That's one of my things that I really enjoy. It's the other stuff I don't like, such as editing and reaching out and all the other stuff that you know well. But as far as having conversations with coaches such as yourself, I could do that all day.
So you kind of got a dual role there then. You do some coaching and you do some coach education. Mm-hmm. Is the coaching education that you're doing just only the podcast, or do you have things that you do through Ignite as well?
So primarily through the podcast. With Emergence, I have put out some blog posts. I did write something for Sportsmith a couple of years ago that was more on this approach that I'm sure we'll get into. From Ignite standpoint, it's primarily the education is done in-house, just kind of upskilling our coaches, creating frameworks for them. Obviously, a lot of this stuff is what they came in the door with, right? They might come from ASU nearby, from an internship. That's how we get a lot of our coaches. And then they have a very traditional mindset on what skill acquisition should look like. And so part of my job is to just give them, what our perspective is and explain to them how we can actually apply it in a setting, because it's one thing to learn about these things and to read an article or read a academic article, but then what does it actually look like? And that's where, again, going back to Emergence, that's what we're trying to do, right? To bridge that gap between these big fancy words that scare everybody and what it actually looks like in a practical setting.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that for sure.
I
have a feeling that's going to be a pretty significant part of the conversation. Let's zoom out a little bit more. You're a pretty young guy. You've been in the industry for a decade or so, probably?
Yeah,
a little bit more.
Yeah.
What got you into the industry? Why did you even travel down this path to begin with?
Well, it was nonlinear. There's one buzzword there. Throw that already. It was nonlinear.
Sean has taught you well.
That's funny. It was nonlinear. For me, I didn't always want to do this. I think a lot of the times, when I'm talking to young people, they think that you're supposed to know what you do right away or what you're gonna do. I was always jealous of those people, like that they knew what they wanted to do. Like friends in high school, I want to be this, I want to be that. I thought I wanted to be a few things and then ended up not being those things. So I thought I wanted to go in the medical field and then realized, man, like 8 years of school or 10 years of school sounds horrible. That's not really my groove. And then so I ended up going down the strength and conditioning path, originally getting there via physical therapy. So
Mm.
I, as an athlete, was extremely injured. I had 4 knee surgeries. I was, the definition of injured and fragile. And so for me, I felt like, that was something that I could leverage and honestly give me a little bit of purpose to help people who, athletes who were coming back and knowing what that's like, experiencing it firsthand, and just what it's like to readapt your skill. So that's what really got me into it. And then throughout that point, I think like a lot of people, I trained, I've trained parents, I've trained high level athletes, I've trained 8-year-olds. So throughout that time, I've trained a large population in my career.
So you kind of just fell into it.
Kind of just fell into it
Yeah.
or pulled me in. Yeah.
Right. How has kind of your motivation for doing what you do and why you do it changed over the course of your 10 or 12 years in so far? Or has it? Like you said when you begun, you like working with developmental
Mhm.
athletes because you feel like you can have the greatest impact. Has that always been the case? Is that kind of what got you in or brought you into this, or how you fell into it from the get-go? All right, I didn't have this. I was injured all the time. Let me try to provide something for the next generation of people coming up. And then that's always been the way. And then, yeah, let's just start there. Let's not go into skill act yet.
Yeah, we're gonna get there. So yeah, I mean that's pretty much been my motivation to just find people, like I mentioned earlier, at like a fork crossing the road. I was gonna say fork in the road, where they are presented with challenging times, and a lot of the times the people in their life aren't always thinking about their well-being or necessarily think about them holistically. Like even if you go down the developmental sports rabbit hole, like the professionalization of sports is something of youth sports is something that we've kind of adopted in this country. It's at this point it's a complex, right? It's a
Mhm.
way for a lot of people to make money, and it's a way to put pressure on parents to be elite athletes right away. Thinking about what you said in the Huberman podcast about seeing an athlete and kind of knowing that they're going to be elite. I think you mentioned to someone you saw. Well, the majority of the kids that we work with aren't going to be that. There might be a few that trickle down and ended up being elite athletes, but for the most part, we want them to be lovers of movement. We want to be able to enjoy moving and enjoy that relationship with sport. It should be a lifelong process. If they want to get into college and play in the NFL, if they want to play Major League Baseball, we'll support them there as well. But that's been my motivation, is just how can I help these kids find the best path for themselves and then fall in love with movement at the end of the day.
Has that been increasingly challenging for you over the last few years as the money begins to trickle down lower and lower and lower and younger and younger and younger now, where, I mean, professional sport now exists as young as 12 almost, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's how have you dealt with those challenges, or have you not been really challenged by that at all?
Well, there's definitely been some challenges. I think, I gave this presentation last week to some members of at an NBA team, and we were talking about that. When they get an NBA player, they've been playing just basketball for maybe 10, 12 years. And so they're already getting an athlete that potentially is highly skilled, but potentially also has a higher risk of injury. And so what I think of is where can I intervene to inject some fun, some variability, some adaptation in a different way from what they've been doing their entire lives. I think the challenging part from a parent and sociocultural perspective is just the parent wants everything for the kid. And I understand it probably comes from a good place of wanting to provide everything that you didn't have. What happens is they end up putting so much pressure on that athlete to be great and elite right away. They want to result instantly without thinking of long-term development. So for us, when a parent comes to us and said, "All right, I want my kid to have perfect sprint form," like, they're 13 years old. I mean, they're going to be growing. This thing is going to change next summer. Let's not focus so much on this. it becomes challenging because they want a result, they're paying us for it, and we have to provide some level of education to the parent in addition to the athlete and train them.
Yeah, it's such a, in many ways, I'm glad I don't work in developmental sport because I think I'd be super challenged by this. I used to think there's I don't know if this is somebody you may know or not. I'm sure a few of the listeners do. The late Tony Wells. He was a track and field coach in Denver, Colorado, and he developed a system that was really high intense work for high school kids and a lot of volume of that intense work. That the kind of the primary piece of that was like heavy strength work, a lot of plyometrics, and a lot of speed work. And it works. It works. And then he ended up kind of being very influential for many other coaches. Some of those coaches working at big programs in the NCAA who run a similar program. So again, heavy strength work, a lot of plyometrics, and a lot of speed work. The problem with such a program is short term, that works. You can get somebody really fast, really strong, really powerful, really quickly. It's one of the easiest things on the planet. But it destroys long-term sustainability. It destroys it. You just can't get through that. You can't get past that. And I always was a bit of a critic of this program until you zoom out a little bit and you think about, all right, what is the objective here? Like, what is Tony Wells's job? His job as a coach of high school kids who, without a scholarship, probably don't go to college. So his job was to get these scholarships for these kids. And then the job of the NCAA coach isn't to prepare them for a professional career. It's to maximize their job, the most points we can get, most points that we can squeeze out of these athletes for the 2, 3, or 4 years that we have them. And I feel like that's really challenging. And then you add into that mix the kids themselves and their ideas. And then, as you pointed out, the parents who are ultimate short-term thinkers. And I feel like, man, that's a really complex mess. And I don't know how I would deal with that. Like Tony Wells put hundreds of students into college that wouldn't have gone to college, right? That's probably a really good thing. Yeah, he's not worried too much about their long-term career, whether they were going to go to the NBA or NFL or whatever, or become professional sprinters. So I feel like it's just such a complex world. Like, do you think about those things? I guess you do. You're working with them every day. And how do you navigate a lot of that complexity and that messiness?
Well, a few minutes in, we brought up complexity. I'm glad we did, but it really is a complex system because the other thing is that, the athletes are doing so many things outside that you're not necessarily aware about, right? So like they could be meeting with skills coaches, or maybe they didn't sleep well. So all these other things that are part of the athlete system are at play. And so what we're trying to do is get at least a dashboard of what they're doing outside of here. Are they sleeping? Are they eating anything but canes and drinking soda? Because that's typically what they do. It's always canes and Chipotle and soda. So what is their nutrition like? What is their parental life like? Like what is their relationship between sport and their parent? Because oftentimes you get kids that are coached by their coach and then immediately coached by their parent when they get in the car. So that can affect how I interact with them. Should I interact with them as that third coach, or do they need me to kind of joke around and talk crap a little bit and just be more light? And sometimes that's what they need. And so I think about what is the athlete doing outside of our care? And then where can I make the most impact? And sometimes it's not a heavy dose of plyometrics, because if you have a volleyball player and they're practicing 5 days a week and they're a middle blocker and they're jumping many times in practice, it probably isn't a good idea for me to do a high, number of plyometrics. So I just try to think where we can fit in to make the most impact. Sometimes it's by really going hard and going full throttle. Other times it's not, where our workouts, when they give us their RPE post-workout, we don't want to be an 8 out of 10 usually. We'll live in that 6, sometimes 7 range, because we try to not be the thing that breaks the system. I don't want to be the thing that breaks the athlete system. I'd rather set them up for long-term success. So that way, and I respect, the idea of them getting into college, but I want them to stay in college. We have a wall of fame in our gym, and there's plenty of athletes in there who didn't finish. Is that my job to help them finish? Maybe not, but I want them to still be in love with that sport and be healthy enough to play 4 years, 5 years, whether they transfer or not, and have a successful college career, because so many of them don't.
So you got into it because you were kind of a broken athlete. So you looked at it probably from a health and performance perspective right from the jump, kind of more of an integrated system, as you say. When did you start going down the skill acquisition route? And what brought you down there? Like what took you? And you know what? I think the job here is more than just this. I feel like it's also that. And maybe if you can describe to some of the listeners, what that journey was and what do we mean by that when we talk about skill acquisition?
Absolutely. So, my journey started, I was in a gym in Chandler, just kind of a general fitness gym, training some athletes, training some gen pop. And then this short guy with some NFL athletes walks in, and then I greet him at the front. And he starts, we start talking after their session. He ended up training some athletes at our gym. And then he's throwing out these big words, skill acquisition terms that I've never heard before. And so it intrigued me. I've always been drawn towards complex things. Like I don't shy away from it. I've always been drawn towards that. So we have these conversations and it starts to call into question what I'm doing. At the time I was doing a lot of what most people would consider agility work, right? Your ladders and your cones and things like that. After meeting this person, Sean Mishka, it kind of opened my
You call him a
eyes.
short guy?
Yeah, he doesn't look that short next to me, but he looks short in my brain. I don't know why. Maybe it's because he's so stocky. But when I picture Sean, he's
not that
short.
short, man.
No,
Come
he's
on.
not. Well, you're 6'3", so it's a little.
Yeah, he's short compared to me, but I'm a little taller than you. I don't know if
Yeah.
you can call Sean a short guy.
Oh, well, when he listens to this, he'll definitely be a little ticked off at me. But anyway, so I meet Sean, and and things start to be questioned, and I'm swimming in this
When are
complexity.
we talking about here? The mid-teens, maybe?
2014, around that
Yeah.
time, 2013, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I was just doing what I had always done. A session starts like this. All right, we warm up, we do some speed ladder work, we do some sprints, whatever it may be, then we go into our lift. Like that's kind of what we did. Or maybe I'll get some good deceleration angles at a cone, and then I'll go into my coach app or whatever the app is, and then draw some X's to make sure the mechanics are really good. So that's what I was doing, like a lot of people.
Yeah,
And so
pretty
typical.
typical.
Meeting Sean, it kind of opened my mind to what could be. And even him, he was on that journey. He wasn't where he is now. And so I went and visited him, and he invited. He said, "Anybody wants to visit?" And of course, nobody raised their hand, but I'm like, "I'll go." So I visited him in Minnesota. I didn't even know him that well at the time, and so then we started this relationship, and then it started to bring into question what I was currently doing. So it wasn't, boom, wake up one day and then change, and now you're viewing skill acquisition differently. To be honest with you, I didn't even think about skill acquisition. I think that's where most coaches have. That's the biggest issue in my opinion, is that most coaches don't have a theory. If you're going to have a theory and defend it, that's okay. But most people just do what they've always done. And that's what I did. And so meeting
So if you were
Sean,
doing,
yeah,
so if you were doing this stuff, like you were running into a cone, you're doing some decels, you're doing some sprints or whatever, what did you think you were doing then? Like, what was it? You were building what?
I thought I was building correct biomechanics.
Okay.
Essentially what I was doing. What I
Okay.
didn't think, and what I think of now, is what was the context of it? What was the environment and the constraints in which the athlete produced?
You were thinking about mechanics though.
I was.
You
I
were
was
thinking about skill in a way, not just capacity. You're not thinking about just getting them bigger, faster, stronger. You're also, okay, what do they look like while they're doing these things? You've
Exactly.
got a model in your brain that you say, okay, this is what I want to see. I'm going to teach this person to do that. So skill acquisition was, maybe you didn't, think of it this way, but it was already part of your job, right?
Yes, exactly. That what I was going to do in practice, in training, would transfer over to their sport.
Got it. And then Sean came in and said, yeah, this is wrong. This is stupid. This is not how it works. How do we then define that? And I'm going to ask you now, how do you define the difference really simply to a community that maybe doesn't understand what the difference is in a way in which they can say, ah, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So obviously that's a challenging to get it down, to distill it down, but I'll do my best. So traditionally, the athlete and the environment are separate. An athlete does something in isolation and they repeat it. The idea is automaticity, repeatability of movement. So we want the same movement in any circumstance, in any setting. That's how I view a traditional approach.
Great.
From ecological dynamics, the environment and the athlete are inextricably linked. You cannot have one without the other. So we talk about context. Environment is one of the biggest one. The context in which the athlete produced that movement. And while we do care about biomechanics, what we really want is not movement repeatability, but repeatability of outcome. So I want the athlete to be able to solve a problem in as many ways as possible. The noise, as I'll call it, in the traditional sense, is usually just a bug, right? Get it out of here, it's noise. We want to isolate movement. For us, the noise is a feature. It
Well, and
guides
by noise, you mean what, variability?
variability, the environment,
Yep.
constraints, right? Things that are shaping an athlete's movement. You know, that's the name of the business, Emergence. Behavior, we believe, emerges from a confluence of constraints at that time. And so that's essentially
Can you define constraints? What do you mean by constraints there?
Sure. So I wish the name was different, because the name constraints, I think people think restrict. But the way we view constraints is it channels behavior. So you have different types of constraints. You have individual, you have task constraints, and you have environmental constraints. So everybody, where at least really good coaches think about constraints, whether they know it or not, but they usually stop at individual, how fast you are, how much power you can produce, what angles you can create, limb length, lived history. Maybe we talked about that. Like, are you working from a sprinter with a sprinter from Europe or from America? I'm sure you think about all that stuff, and most coaches do. But where we don't always think about is what's the task? What is the situation? So if we were to take, I know you love American football. So the sport of American football, if I have a receiver and they're running a route, they can run it on air, but it's different depending on what the person in front of them, the defensive back, is doing. If they're playing press coverage, so closer, that's going to change how they run the route. If they're playing off coverage, that's going to change how they run the route, down in distance. So essentially what that receiver has to do is learn how to run the same route many different ways. And so that's where we talk about, again, repeatability of outcome. You want to win in any way possible, not just produce something that looks super clean.
Mm-hmm. What's the, by the way, that's I think a really good short overview of the differences.
Thank you.
What's the biggest critique that a critic of such a way of operating would have for the type of work or the type of understanding that you just outlined? And for me, I don't feel like anything you just said is that controversial. But, one critique would be, well, our job as quote unquote performance coaches or strength and conditioning coaches, just to get them bigger, stronger, faster, and then allow the game to work on all of those other problem solving tools. What would you say to that? And is there other critiques that are maybe a little bit more robust than that?
Oh, there's a lot of them, so we can get into any of them that you want. But the game is the teacher, right? There's this idea that weight room, speed, and agility, right? You teach that, and then the game teaches itself. But what if you can take slices of the game and bring them into your training sessions? Because if we believe the game is the teacher, which we can debate that, I think there's a way of saying the game is the teacher because people are doing the thing. But there's also a way of saying that the game can be overwhelming. Your athletes aren't maybe faced in specific situations that you can kind of, not hate to use the word isolate, but kind of isolate specific situations. So if we can take elements of the game and better prepare our athletes, why would we do that? So that's one thing that I would say. I would say the other thing is that if we look, and I will, use American football again, just because it's obvious, and you can go on Twitter and see this, but if you look at some of the practice drills that are done, I mean, they're pretty far from the game. They're very, very far from the game. I wrote I wrote an article for that Sportsmith article I mentioned earlier, and this running back is running and there's a helmet on a stick and he's stiff arming the helmet. It's like, okay, do we really believe that that is somehow getting this all pro running back better at football? It seems that it's just going through the motions. So that would be one, as far as letting the game teach. I'm happy
I
to
feel
also.
though, let's just put a pin in that
Yeah.
real quick. I feel like in American football, in this sense, is really unique. There's some really bad coaching being done in American football, no question.
Mhm.
It's a circus. But I feel like in many other sports, it's not that way. And I feel like many of the coaches who are operating as the quote unquote skill acquisition people, the technical coaches, not the S&C or the performance staff, do a better job of understanding the contextual demands of the sport here and the task that they're trying to improve players to do. And for the most part, I feel like it's being done pretty well. You just look at, you know, how do most of the tactical, technical demands and even some of the strategic demands in soccer look like in training? And it's all small-sided games. And that's been done all over the world. So we're just decontextualizing a little bit. We're isolating slightly, but not a lot. We're just dropping the context to a part where the players can kind of understand it, but still be challenged by it. And I feel like most sports are kind of that. So they're already, so I guess the question is in that case, are you seeing or are you looking at, all right, this skill acquisition piece is being taken care of here. So my job or my role here within this system is slightly different. But in football, it's not, because you got a bunch of Muppet coaches that are have a stick and throwing, hitting this boxing glove at the end of a stick with a running back. And I get it. Like I see that, and it's laughable. It's totally laughable. But I don't know if that is the actual state of play across the world in all sports.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely some good things going on in soccer. I think small-sided games is a great start, but I think there's a level to be taken even further, right? As far as designing activities with even greater complexity, but especially if you're working with elite level athletes, like the higher level the athlete, ideally the greater complexity you put in your problem-solving setting. So I do think there are sports that are doing a better job than some. Obviously, American football is significantly behind the times. There's some great people in hockey as well that they're starting to, USA Hockey is starting to integrate modern skill acquisition principles. I think where I guess most of these things that I see, it's so focused on an output, which is important, but not necessarily considering the environment or the setting at which the output occurred. And so we get real into specificity. Okay, we're going to do multi-directional sprinting. Great. We're going to add in maybe some variability, which I don't see super often. But then what was the environment that it occurred? So soccer does a good job, but I would argue that potentially there can be another level that other sports can reach in considering context, right? We talk about context and we're really good about talking about it from a weight room standpoint. We understand that like a heavy squat may not transfer to certain athletes for a vertical jump, but we don't think about it from an environmental standpoint. So I think to get the next level would be to incorporate elements of what they're actually going to see and to kind of periodize that along the season. So that way they are getting better prepared, in my opinion, for what they're actually going to see on the field or the pitch or wherever it might be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Again, I don't think there's anything that controversial in any of that. I struggle sometimes to see why it doesn't the get the entire community believing in some of these ideas. I've talked to Sean quite a lot about this and will continue to.
Yeah.
You mentioned a little bit earlier ecological psychology, and I feel like even this is probably one of the bottlenecks. People even hear this ecological psychology and what is that? So can you define that? Tell me why, or tell us why, the listeners why, that is the appropriate framing of why we should be maybe training athletes in a more contextual way. What is it about ecopsych or maybe ecological dynamics or whatever? Why is that the way that we should be thinking about these things?
So I guess I can start with like a scenario. So have you ever taken a boxing class or done a kickboxing class or anything like that?
Yes.
Have you ever been in a ring sparring and doing those same things?
Yes.
It's a pretty significant gap between
It's a
those.
massive gap.
It's two different things. We're
Yeah.
training two different things.
Yes.
The environments are totally different. The demands are totally different. And so what ecological psychology can do is incorporate the environment as part of someone's perception. It's part of someone's life as they navigate the world. We usually think of this person creating not to get too in the weeds, like a representation, right? A representation that they have to have an indirect experience with the environment. Ecological psychology, ecological dynamics would say that we experience it directly. So it's not about enhancing some stored model that we create. It's about becoming more attuned and more sensitive to specifying information, i.e., what you actually see. So in that same scenario, if I'm thinking about boxing somebody, I can hit the mitts all I want. But what's going to give me what I have to perceive is the distance between me and the opponent. What I have to perceive is, well, did they bite on any fakes previously? And so by embedding athletes in those situations, they can become more attuned, more sensitive, and pick up those affordances, which all an affordance is an invitation to act, and it's specific to that athlete. Then they can become more skillful where it matters most, the game. The other element, and I think we definitely agree on this part, is this idea of complex systems that we view the human movement system from many different angles. We don't know that the output will always equal the same thing every time. We can't determine that. And so it's this idea of complex systems and ecological psychology, which underpins an ecological dynamics framework. We can think about it as embedding the athlete in the environment and allowing them to become more attuned to what they're actually going to see.
Ecological psychology, ecological dynamics. What is the difference between those two concepts?
Ecological dynamics is like a combination of ecological psychology and complex systems.
Got it. And ecological psychology, where did that come from, and how did this then become a part of what we do now as coaches? Like talk me through that path, and maybe I can better understand that.
Yeah. So ecological dynamics, the father of ecological dynamics of bridging the two is Keith Davids. He's kind of the one that was the preeminent author of a lot of the papers of viewing this idea of skill acquisition differently. There's been other people that have influenced, like this idea of affordances was J.J. Gibson. He was the first really one to kind of discuss these ideas. And then we talk about, and I don't want to make this too in the weeds, but a constraints-led approach, right, which is part of it, is Carl Newell, right? This constraint triangle that people may have seen before. So all of these ideas formulate a modern approach to skill acquisition. If you want to go even further, we talk about Nikolai Bernstein and the hammer, right? The person hitting the hammer, a fairly closed task. But yet within that task, there was a great amount of variability in that task, which points to the idea that if we are humans and variability is part of our system, we're meant to be variable, adaptable athletes, like should we train people in a way that isn't aligned with that? And so that's where this idea, and you had people, to be honest with you, there was not a lot of people using this. Like Sean was one of the earlier ones, where trying to put these ideas that are primarily theoretical and what does it actually look like? So this idea of repetition without repetition, essentially embracing variability, of constraining the environment, manipulating something, and then allowing a behavior to emerge are all fairly new as far as the practice, but the thoughts and ideas have been around for over 30 years.
So first step for maybe for listeners who, this type of thinking might be somewhat new. And I feel like for me, my first step was just understanding that, like, I was kind of like you, right? And like most coaches who are kind of scientific or really interested in the actual movement, is I had a model in mind. And I said, oh, this is what I want this athlete to look like. And whether that was pushing a bobsled, pushing a skeleton sled, skating, sprinting, accelerating, whatever. I had this model, this perfect model. And everybody needed to, I needed to, I need to coach in a way in which I could get the athletes that I'm working with to look like this. And I was very technical. And then I would break down that model into a bunch of component parts and try to figure out how to rebuild those parts into this whole again. Very, very typical whole coaching. That was the way in which everybody did it for decades. And my entry point into these ideas was like early O's with, I think it was, primarily Professor Joan Vickers at University of Calgary, who's I took some courses with, who's who introduced us to some of these ideas. I said, this is really interesting. And the first one was, an individual is not the average of all individuals. Everyone's different. Everyone is going to move in a slightly different way. Our first job then should be to try to understand those differences and then try to create an environment in which we can take advantage of some of the gifts that these athletes have that may lead to some of these differences. So that was my entry point. And okay, this for me makes sense to me. And then from that, I started learning more about variability and all of these different things. There's a lot of terms within this now, right? There's a lot of things that you've thrown out in the last 10 minutes. And you can see a lot of coaches come in and say, man, that's a lot. It's a lot of new stuff I got to understand. Like, what is the entryway? Like, here's a door. You can understand this. Hey, come in. Come in. It's just one door, man. Let's say, yeah, that totally makes sense. Let me go in this door. And then you find some of these things in this room rather than just, you're in this room and you got all this stuff. Like, what is the door for you?
Yeah, no.
What was it for you with Sean?
So for me with Sean, it was information. It was understanding that there is certain information in movement that guides what the athlete ultimately does. There was a question that he posed to me years ago that was, what are my athletes attuning to and what are they adapting around? So essentially, like, what are they picking up visually, and then what are they organizing their movements around? Like, we all do that. We all organize our movements around something, at least in our perspective. And so for me, it was a simple 5-10-5 drill, pro agility drill that everybody's done. And it was, okay, let's add some variability, which is another gateway that we can talk about. Let's just move the cone. Why does it have to be 5 yards? Could it be 6? Could it be at an angle?
No, it can't be 6, man. It has to be 5.
Get me 5.
That's crazy talk. You lost everybody right now.
Right. Why does it have to be 5? Could it be 4? Do they have to start facing the same way? So those kind of things. Okay. And then after that, it was, well, why don't you just get rid of the cone entirely? Why don't you have someone standing, replacing the cone, and then you are basing whether you decelerate and reaccelerate the other direction off of where they're at. They move up to 3 yards. Okay, I better stop before I run into them. And so that was kind of the entry point when we can think about information about what our athletes are seeing. And then with variability, when we understand the human movement system is designed for variability. It's when we think about, this is maybe go off topic, but we'll see if it lands. But we think about humans, right? We're not the fastest. If we try to outrun a grizzly bear, you're going to be lunch. You're going to be dead. But what we do have is, in an abundance of movement options, we have an incredible amount of degrees of freedom to coordinate and to become very adaptable. We have this idea of what we call movement degeneracy. So it's many ways to do the same task. Like, if you can imagine, if I went to go grab this mug and I only had one way to grab it, like, how ridiculous would that be, right? So we are bred for this. We are born for, we've evolved to have this natural inherent variability. And once we start going down the variability rabbit hole and we start going down the information rabbit hole, then we can start to see, maybe we can start to just make a little bit more, add a little bit more variability here, remove a cone here. And that's all the start you need. You can pick up the terms because they are new and can be confusing. You can pick up the terms as you go. I don't think that should be a gatekeeping thing for people to get into this approach. I think it can be to some, and I don't think it should be.
Yeah, no, that's well said. I tend to agree with that. And I think that's a good, that is a good gateway. I think it's a good first step. And I understand and respect the power of information and variability. And I don't feel like that is overly complex. I feel like you can do that. You know what I mean? I think you outlined that really well in about 5 minutes. So it's like, I don't think that's a super complex topic. So where is then the challenge in getting some of those ideas across? Like, you just, as I said, you outlined that really well, really easily, that I don't feel like is that controversial in 5 minutes. Where is then the challenge, and how come it's not landed with a large part or percentage of the community? Why aren't we seeing significant changes? And yeah, I know that's a lot. That's a big question.
No, that's
I understand that. So
okay.
I didn't want to ask that question, but it just came out. So it's
yeah.
We can attack it if you want.
Yeah, I do. Let's try. So I think, that's a complex question, obviously, but I think one of them is this idea that the learner the learner and the coach, this relationship, I think, has to be repositioned a little bit. So typically, it's like a marionette. You might have seen the graphic of someone, I'm going to tell the athlete to do this, and therefore they're going to do this. We want to reposition as someone that's more of an architect of an environment, a guide. So watering the plant, if you will, instead of pressing the A button on the joystick. And so I think that's the biggest thing, because in order to do that, you have to do something that a lot of coaches can't do, and that's not talk. Very hard for us to do that. Doesn't mean you can't ever talk, but that means you have to allow things to emerge. And that sometimes is messy, and that makes us uncomfortable. Messiness is not what we want to see. We're very visual based creatures. We like to see things that look nice and neat. And when we see mess, we think that we're not doing our job. When in reality, messiness here might mean retention later. And at the end of the day, if our job is to try to make our athletes more skillful, then that is going to serve them in the long run. So I feel like that is one of the problems. And then I guess the last thing is this idea of uncertainty. It's very easy for me to show up with a drill book and go A, B, C, D, E. There's obviously a level of skill to that. I'm not saying there isn't, but it is another story when I do A and I see that my athletes need to spend more time in A and I skip B entirely. And then I go back to A again. And so this idea of nonlinearity, I think, also makes people very uncomfortable. There's an uncertainty with this type of approach. It's frustrating when people say it depends. No one likes to hear that, right? But if I said that, it's true for most things. And so I think that is where people have a hard time embracing this approach.
In your experience, then, do you find that most people just want to be told what to do and may not have the curiosity to go a bit deeper to learn some of these things? And that's why maybe these traditional systems where you're just reading off a piece of paper, we do A drill, B drill, C drill, D drill. Do you feel like most of the community is kind of just still stuck in that paradigm? Do you feel like that's the problem?
I
Or do you
think
feel like it is a problem with the communication itself?
I think you could probably say it's both. I would say that people, you said something, I'm quoting you now. I don't want to quote verbatim, but you said something at a presentation you did for us. And you said something to the effect of, my job today is to open up a portal for you to go through. I don't know if you remember saying that. It was one of your SMSC presentations. And so I think what people want sometimes is the drill book. They don't want to go through the portal. Going through a portal and learning more is essentially like, if we think about cooking, there's a recipe and there's learning how to cook. And a lot of the times people want the recipe book, when in reality, what's going to serve their athletes and them in the long term is going through that portal, is learning how to cook, is understanding some of the methodologies. So that way you are not reliant on someone else's situation, because what may work for you may not work for me. You know, you're working with a different type of athlete than I am. What may work for Sean in his elite American football athletes, if you listen to Sean and you copy him, then you are missing the boat. You're not getting the point. The point is to understand the concepts and then create your own recipes. And then as far as the language, I think it's complex, because I do believe people should take ownership and learn the language. But again, I don't think that should be a barrier of entry, because at some point I do need to understand what it means. It's new. Like, did you grow up and you knew what a sagittal plane was? You didn't know what that word was when you were in 5th grade, but you learned it. And it became, now it's commonplace. So I just think some of this stuff is so new that people get really uncomfortable with new and unknown. And instead of, for me, like, if we were to talk and you were to expose me to a bunch of different things, I'm like, cool, like, I'm good with this complexity. A lot of people aren't. So I think we have to get comfortable with that, or more comfortable with that as a profession.
Yeah, that's well said. Have you had to, or what have you had to unlearn from traditional S&C to make room and space for new ways, new things? What have you thrown out?
It's still hard, but how much I talk, like the instant wanting to give feedback right away
Yeah,
is something that is hard, because if you film yourself, it's a funny thing. If you film yourself, record
yeah.
yourself training or coaching, it's like, oh, good, or whatever you say, like this random stuff that you say that are almost as idiosyncrasies. And so unlearning this idea that I have to jump in right away, that I have to tell them, I think by nature, I like to help people. I think most of us got in this profession because we enjoy helping people. Maybe some people don't, but I'd like to think most people enjoy helping people. And sometimes by having that attitude of just wanting to jump in and help them right away, we take away their agency and their ability to figure stuff out on their own, which ultimately is what they're going to need to do. So just learning how to use language as a constraint for good and not just talk all the time and take away that agency and that ownership from that athlete.
We talk a lot about context, and part of that context is the athlete's own experience, their own subjective experience, their own history and histories of working through things, being coached by different coaches. We are typically the latest coach in a line of sometimes dozens of coaches who have often coached in very different ways and then given the athletes a expectation of what coaching looks like and feels like to them. So how does that challenge you when the coach wants you to say something, wants feedback, needs feedback in a sense, because this is their entire history of subjective experience with coaching, where they've been fed back to, and now you come in and you're a little bit, I'm going to facilitate this session. I'm going to guide you. I'm going to set up the constraints. I'm going to do this and this. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I won't do that. You're going to have athletes that get frustrated by that. I know that. I know this firsthand because I see this all the time. What is then, do you say, all right, I'm going to give you a little piece here. But just know that the goal here is to allow you to be a big part of this. It's not for me to tell you what to do. It's you to be able to figure it out. That's the goal. So there may be a period of time where we have to work together through that. Is that kind of the way in which you would approach that?
Yeah, I think giving them a little bit of what they want is helpful in long-term success and growth and maintaining a good relationship, because it can be a complete switch, right? I think for one thing that we do is having those conversations early, like even in the warm-up. Our warm-up doesn't look like a standard warm-up. So for example, one of the things we do is they'll just do what we call multi-directional or ownership squats, right? Where they're just squatting in a bunch of different ways. So even getting an athlete to do that, they're looking at me like, or they'll get stuck. I'm like, you really don't know how to squat anyway but your feet forward. I mean, a squat is just a pattern. It doesn't have to be something that is
Not even a
always
pattern. It's
not
just
even a
it's a
pattern.
made-up exercise.
Made up exercise. You're right. Made up
Oh, it is.
exercise.
Yeah.
And so it's like we're bending our knees. Let's put it like that. We're
Yeah.
bending our knees in a bunch of different ways.
Yeah.
And so right then and there, they've gotten a little bit of taste. Okay, this is going to be different. So we embed them within that environment early as possible. And I think the other thing that can go a long way, again, with this approach, we don't have the answers as a coach. And one thing we do a terrible job of, a lot of people, I'm not saying you or anybody in particular, is embedding our athletes, asking them like how that feels, or does this look like, is this look like rugby? I don't know. I didn't play rugby. I'm assuming. So was this activity relevant for you? And so things like that, where you're incorporating the athlete in their own journey, as Tyler would say, inviting them to their own party. I think that's really important as well. Like getting buy-in that way, I think will go a long way as well.
Yeah, no, I like that. That's good. I think that's all I got, man. I feel like there was something else I was gonna ask you at the end there, and I just totally blanked on it. But I feel like that's about it. Anything that we haven't addressed? I feel like that was a really nice overview, pretty simple, really well stated. I don't feel like it's gone over the heads of anyone. Is there anything that you think that we haven't discussed that you'd like to discuss?
No, I think it was pretty comprehensive. I just feel like I want coaches to just be open-minded. And I want coaches, anybody who listens to this and who decides tomorrow they want to change some things, just understand that you have to be adaptable as well. If you want your athletes to learn and to struggle, you're going to struggle as well. What I see oftentimes is people start this journey and then, they hit this trough of despair where you don't know what the hell you're doing, or you design an activity and it sucks, right? Anybody who's done this has designed a drill or an activity and it sucks. Just I would advise people or push people to just go through it. We're asking a lot of our athletes, so we need to ask, I think, more of ourselves to be adaptable. But I think it's it's something that takes time, and to give yourself a little patience as well. Give yourself a little grace.
Yeah, well said. Curiosity sort of got you into this. You're clearly still curious. What is your current kind of process of self-education like? Do you just, all right, here's a problem I'm dealing with today. Let me figure out how to solve this problem by talking to my friends, colleagues, researching, or is it a little bit more structured than that? And then we'll leave it off after that.
Yeah. Well, I get a lot from conversations. Like I selfishly, that's why I created the podcast, was
Yeah.
to learn from people such as yourself, Sean, Tyler, any of the other, we've had 90, I think we're at 98, 99 episodes. So
Nice.
each one of
Who's
those,
your 100th guest?
yeah, I got to figure that out. That's a big honor. I don't know. I think about doing a compilation. I don't want to, I don't know if I want to give that away. Maybe it'll just
And
be,
that's got to be a self thing. That's just you. That's just
yeah.
right.
Yeah, I don't think I want to do a compilation, but or sorry, I don't think I want to have a guest.
No.
But I learn a lot from that, and then once I get an idea, I actually, and this might be similar to you, I really dive deep into that idea for a little bit of time, and then I kind of move on to something else until it
Yeah.
piques my interest again.
Mm.
So whether that's searching for articles, whether that's, I wish YouTube was a better resource because I like watching videos. But I would say conversations, and then from that, finding articles, going into Google, seeing what comes up, and then reading those is how I've educated myself. I think one thing, just to give myself a little bit of a call to action, is also getting other perspectives. I think that I could do a better job with getting other perspectives. I think that's something that we need to do a better job of, and not just hear, the echo chamber.
Yeah, that's a good point. Javi, I appreciate you, man.
No problem. Can I plug one thing?
You can plug two things. Actually,
Oh,
plug three things. You plug one, I'll plug two.
okay, perfect. So if you're interested in learning more about this approach, how it lives and breathes, and what it looks like, because that the people are going to listen to this that might be intrigued, but then what next? We are doing a conference called the Sport Movement Skill Conference. It is in person this year. I don't know if you saw that. So we're super excited about that.
I
That's
haven't
going
got
to
my
be.
invite yet, man. So
Oh, well,
I'm gonna have words with Sean.
yeah, take it up with that guy. But it is June 26th and 27th in Minnesota. I'm going to be one of the presenters. Obviously, Sean will, Tyler, Rob Gray, who's that's a great book, by the way, a great resource for anybody who's interested, very digestible.
Which
So
book
he'll
is
be
that?
there. How We Learn to Move.
Okay.
Yeah, How We Learn to Move. Scott Seavright, who also adopts this approach. He's an MMA. So if you want to take the boxing analogy further, he's the one. Garrett Baker, who's with the Mets. You're starting to see these ideas start to go up to the highest level. And there's also Justin Ferguson, who's in soccer. He will be there as well. He works with the Minnesota United, I believe.
Nice. That's at the end of June.
Yeah.
Emergence.com, is that where people go to?
Yeah. So it should be there. And also I can send you the link. It's on Eventbrite. This is what we usually use to create it, but emergentmovement.com. So MVMT. And then last thing, I'm sure you're going to talk about this, I guess, is the presentation in Chicago. I'm very excited about and appreciate the invite for the ALTIS Speed Summit. So this was a nice warm up for that.
Yeah, man. I can't wait for that. It's gonna be fun. And aren't you coming up to do an ACP, right?
I am. Yeah, I'll be there May 7th, I think, Wednesday. So just finalize the details with Andreas. So.
Awesome. That's going to be fun. It's I feel like we've got about 20 or 25 people coming to that already, so that will sell out. So if you're listening to this and want to come join us for a week in Phoenix in the middle, I don't even know what the date is.
I think it's May
May
7th, I
May
want to say.
7th. All right.
Yeah, you should
come
probably
join
know
us.
though.
There's a bunch of options there. Come and see us in Phoenix, come to Chicago, or go to Minnesota to the Sport Movement Skill Conference.
Yes, sir.
What is it now? Number 8 or so?
7 or 8, something like that. I've been to, yeah, we're back in person. We were online, and we need to see people. We need to, people need to do the thing. So
Absolutely. Appreciate it, man. Thanks for coming on.
of course, thanks for having me.
Well, that was a really enjoyable conversation. Javi's built something really cool at Ignite. His thoughtful approach to movement and skill development really stood out. He was able to communicate some pretty complex ideas, I thought, really well. Like, I feel like if you listened to this, whatever it was, 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and you didn't know anything about some of these ideas going in, I think you've got a pretty good understanding of them now, just in less than an hour. So good job, Javi. Big thanks again to our sponsors, 3x4 Genetics, Stat Sports, 1080 Sprint, and Team Builder for supporting these conversations, as well as the ALTIS Speed Summit. We'll see you in Chicago, June 6th, 7th, and 8th. Tickets are at altis.world. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.